Good evening and welcome to tonight's live program. I'm Erin Greenwald, Vice President of Public Programs at the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight's conversation with Vanguard author Martha S. Jones and historian and New Orleans native Leslie Harris is the culminating keynote program in the LEH's special initiative, Who Gets to Vote? Conversations on Voting Rights in America. Since we launched the series in late 2020, people from across Louisiana have participated in critical, thoughtful, and passionate conversations about the history of voting and efforts to suppress the vote in the United States. These conversations took place in public libraries in Ascension, Bossier, Jefferson Davis, Orleans, Rapide, St. Tammany, Terrebonne, Vermilion, and West Baton Rouge parishes, as well as at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette's Dupré Library. All of these conversations used award-winning peer-reviewed texts as the basis for facilitated discussions. Participants represented a truly diverse cross-section of Louisiana residents, including farmers, poll workers, high school students, voting rights advocates, teachers, retirees, clergymen, and others. Each brought unique perspectives and shared their own experiences of civic engagement. They also brought open minds and a willingness to listen to each other across what can sometimes seem an insurmountable political divide. We are so thankful to the Federation of State Humanities Councils and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their financial support of Who Gets to Vote, which is part of the Federation's Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative. We look forward to continuing to provide opportunities for open dialogue and civil discourse in communities across Louisiana. A few housekeeping notes for tonight's program. This conversation is being recorded and live streamed via Facebook Live using Zoom webinar, which means that the only people visible on screen will be the presenters. If during the conversation you have a question you'd like answered during the question and answer period, please use the Q&A function, not the chat window. The Q&A icon is located at the bottom of your screen, and you can click it, and type your question there. We've reserved about 15 minutes at the end of the conversation for audience questions. And now for the main event. We're so fortunate to welcome Martha Jones and Leslie Harris for a conversation on the groundbreaking and award-winning book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Vanguard author Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. She's president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, the oldest and largest association of women historians in the United States, and she sits on the executive board of the Organization of American Historians. In addition to Vanguard, Jones is the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, and All Bound Up Together, The Women Question in African American Public Culture from 1830 to 1900. She's written extensively for public outlets, including the Washington Post, Atlantic, USA Today, and more. Tonight's interviewer is Leslie Harris, a professor of history at Northwestern University. Harris is the author or editor of 3 award-winning books, including In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City from 1626 to 1863, Slavery in New York, which was co-edited with Ira Berlin, and Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, which was co-edited with Dinah Ramey Berry. Dr. Harris is currently completing a book on late 20th century New Orleans entitled Leaving New Orleans, A Personal Urban History. Welcome, Martha. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that generous introduction. And it was just wonderful to hear all the libraries throughout Louisiana that have been part of this program, all the different people. This is such a vital conversation for everyone to be involved with. So I'm just delighted to be part of this evening and this closing event.
Thanks.
I want to take a few minutes. Martha and I have known each other for a long time. We also talked about Vanguard in a public conversation in September 2020 as the book was just coming out. And it's a real pleasure and honor for us to be able to talk together again, even though we're good friends. We don't always get to talk together. So I want to say a few words to Martha about the book, about its significance, and then open up to a conversation. So first, I want to congratulate Martha on the success of Vanguard. Sold out of its first printing. It has been nominated and received many awards. Most recently this week, I believe, was named the LA Times Book Prize in History, which is wonderful. Its most important achievement, as Erin already said, is to recenter Black women's activism in politics. And I think that this is important to understand. We often focus on the vote. The focus of this series is the vote. The focus of 2020 was women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment. And there were many moments of commemoration, celebration of that. But Martha's book starts in the early 19th century before many women, with the exception of some women in New Jersey who did have the right to vote. There were a few women who had the right to vote in the late 18th, early 19th century, but that quickly, sadly vanishes. But she starts with Black women who we think probably did not experience the right to vote. And so I really want us to also think about the ways in which voting is one element of political activism, but even to enable voting, we need a lot of other elements of political activism. And I think Martha does a fantastic job of describing that, of describing Black women's unique role in activism on behalf of the vote. And from that early time period in the 19th century, all the way through to the present. The book ends with Stacey Abrams. We were speaking in September 2020 when Abrams, who had made an historic run for the governorship of Georgia, had not, of course, achieved that, but made a bigger, in some ways, important historic contribution in terms of her activism of encouraging the vote. And so I hope that we can get to some of that. I want to also emphasize what it means to position Black women in the vanguard, what Martha has done by doing this, and who the we are. The subtitle of the book, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. We're in a moment when some in the nation feel very constrained in this nation. We're experiencing limiting access to voting. We're experiencing a constraint on equal opportunity to the ballot. And I'm just going to name a couple of examples from Georgia, be that in terms of the number of voting booths in some neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods, the people who can access voting machines in 5 minutes versus those who have to wait online for hours. These are ways in which places are limiting equal access and equal opportunity. And when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, equal access and equal opportunity were supposed to be the ways that we would live into the new civil rights era out of fear of affirmative action. So now we don't even hear about equal access, equal opportunity anymore. And we see that those things are being limited. But the thing with the Black women that Martha emphasizes is that they are fighting for equality for all. And I was thinking, one image I have is that these are people who are on the bottom in this nation, and looking up, they can see that there's enough room for all. The other thing, and I don't usually quote the Bible, but as I was thinking about this equality for all, Martha's like, where are you going with this? I was thinking about the loaves and the fishes and the apostles, and we can't feed all these people. And Jesus said, yes, we can, and they did. The wine at the wedding at Cana, we've run out of wine. No, we haven't. So even there, people who living in fear, being told we don't have enough, and then it being demonstrated that we do have enough. Now we're being told we don't have enough. We don't have enough space for more people. We can't find more places to put voting machines. We don't have enough money or jobs to go around. We don't have enough time for everyone who is eligible to vote. But the women in your book and the way that you describe are women who are first grounded in spirituality, and maybe I was drawing on some of that, but also grounded in the idea that there is enough to go around. There is enough space. And they keep fighting that battle. So Martha, I hope that I've, in that overview sort of created some space, both to talk about the book, as you've written this beautiful book with so many examples of activism that I think each one of us can draw on and think about as we continue to live in somewhat perilous times. Again, I'm thinking that we met in the fall when we were wondering what the outcome of the election would be. We are now meeting, is it only the day after? It feels much longer, the day after the Derek Chauvin decision, court decision. And a lot of things have changed in that time, but clearly we are still in a struggle in this nation about these ideas of equality, of access, of political access in particular, as your women are. So I guess if you'd like to respond to any of that or add to any of that, I would appreciate it. And then I can ask you some questions as well.
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you to Erin Greenwald and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for including Vanguard among the books that folks have been reading through this program. Thank you very much to you, Leslie Harris, for joining me again for a conversation about this book. And yeah, we never, I think, could have imagined where we'd be here in spring of 2021 when we were talking, even as this was a book that tried to, that tries to think, all the way through to 2020, and a figure like leader Stacey Abrams, I think that there were a lot of things that we were able to anticipate about 2020, the centennial anniversary, for example. But I don't think that I had any inkling, right, of the dynamics that would drive the election cycle, the long election cycle that we've lived through, the resurgence of the movement for Black lives with a kind of not only intensity, but a kind of breadth that I think we have not seen in this country in a very long time. And the roles that Black women played, key junctures in this entire story. I was somebody who, by the time the November election shook out, really believed that it was time to stop, the faint praise of dubbing Black women firsts, because in fact, what the election cycle had demonstrated, and the year had demonstrated, in fact, was that Black women have become a force in American politics. And I think one of the really challenging things to wrestle with is the seeming disjuncture, right, between the possibility of Black American women who are, changing the outcome of very fraught national contests like that of the presidency in 2020, Black women who are elected vice president of the United States, unprecedented. But that it's more than just firsts and breaking barriers. Now we're seeing Black women as a force, and still we recognize the profound inequalities, right, that continue to plague the lives of Black women. And part of my rethinking has been how to hold on to the notion that both things are true, right? Both things are true in this country, in this moment. And that, I think, is an observation, but it's also a kind of existential, right, question, right, about who we are as a country and where we're headed. And Black women figure importantly, whether we're looking at the, at the mudsill at the bottom, right, or we're looking at the pinnacle, and how to get those two stories to meet somewhere, I think, is part of the challenge of the next generations.
That's real. I appreciate that. I think you're absolutely right. There is this sense of incredible success. And of course, it even precedes in some way, if we think about, quote unquote, the squad, this group of very diverse women of African descent from many parts, not just of the country, also of the world, who have influenced Congress, joined by an older generation. I think, of course, of Maxine Waters and others who have been there a long time. And there are other women we could also name who've been in the Senate and in the House. And we continue to struggle with the breadth of experience, if you will, to just put it very plainly, between women in those bodies who seem to have influence, although there are moments when they are disrespected and are not allowed to wield the influence without being harassed in some way. And so even women at the top, people try to make them sometimes feel like the mudsill, as you put it. And then many people are struggling. Coronavirus, of course, the continued brutality in the streets that we still are dealing with. I want to take us back to the 19th century, and I want to take us back. I'd love to hear you talk about this, but also with a purpose. I don't know if you've gotten this question over time. I get this question a lot. The year that we had in 2020, the ways in which racial disparities were revealed again, some of us, they were not revealed, they continued, but for some, it was a revelation again, that some changes had not happened in the way that we had imagined. And I often get this question, particularly as an historian of slavery of the 19th century, nothing has, what has changed, or nothing seems to have changed, or more of a statement, I should say, nothing seems to have changed. And you began this book again with the earliest, not the earliest, but some very early figures, certainly in US history, who are activists, who are political activists. And I guess I would love to hear you talk a little bit about them and what challenges they faced that are different from the challenges we face today. And how they, obviously, as I said already, they couldn't vote, but there are other challenges that they faced. And so if there are any of those women, example of their lives that you could speak to, and since they could not have a voice in the way that we think of today, how did they find their voice?
Sure. I'll invoke, if I could, Mariah Stewart, who I think folks are surprised to learn is the first, as best we know, the first American woman to speak about politics from a podium to a mixed audience. She's a Black American woman in Boston, Massachusetts in the early 1830s, has spent her young life as a servant, migrates to Boston, marries, is widowed, and is out of the challenges and the degradations, frankly, of widowhood, turns to church, but is inspired to politics, feels that there's an urgency in her community. Massachusetts is a place where slavery has been abolished, but the legacies of slavery, anti-Black racism persist. And Stewart is eager herself, but for Black women to have a part, right, in the struggles that she hopes will bring Black Americans to full citizenship, to equal rights, and more. She begins with the pen, which is characteristic of many of the women in this book, partners with the anti-slavery journalist and activist William Lloyd Garrison, who publishes, helps to publish some of her early writings. But from there, she is invited to the podiums of Boston. And it turns out she is fiery, she is forthright. She is prepared not only to speak for the Sisters of Africa, as she will sometimes put it, but also to directly challenge men about the ways in which they are not measuring up, they are not fulfilling the needs politically of their community. And this, I think, is what gets her into trouble. There are two things about Mariah Stewart's experience, and it's important to say she is basically, run off the podium in very short order, and will go on to be an educator and have a long and important public life as an educator. But her career at the podium is short. And I think there are two things we can learn from her, many things, but two things. And excuse me, and I do want to credit historian Marilyn Richardson, who first collected and published Stewart's work, and we rely upon that even today. The first is to remember that in order to build a political movement, in order to act, to do, Black women need ideas. And so Stewart is someone who is, among other things, a thinker, an intellectual, who is crafting a political philosophy. The beginnings of what today we call intersectionality are being crafted there on the pages of The Liberator, in her pamphlets, at the podium in Boston. And so it was important for me to go back and find the roots of the ideas, the thinking that would lead Black women to do remarkable things in the public realm. I think that's one thing. The other question that is always hard for historians to answer is why, something didn't happen, right? Why didn't Stewart have a longer career? Why wasn't she better accepted? One way to think about that is, in the 1830s, for most Americans, including Black Americans, someone like Mariah Stewart is unimaginable, right? She doesn't exist literally in the imagination. I think her very presence at the podium, and then she opens her mouth and is sort of eloquent and more, just doesn't compute for folks, right? Because they've never seen it before. And we know this about early women political figures in the United States. People come out to hear them just to gawk, right? Just because they've never seen it before, even if they disagree with it, even if they decry it. So I think Stewart teaches us about political imagination. And what has changed, I think, over the course of many, many, many years in this country, is that while there are those who would still, if you will, run Black women off the podium, I saw the effort to censure the Congresswoman just yesterday. That is akin, right, to trying to run her off the public stage. That is not that does not emanate out of the unimaginable problem. It emanates out of the fraught and disturbed nature of American politics. But Maxine Waters is someone whom we recognize. Even Kamala Harris is someone who Americans recognize, even if they would disagree with her or not vote for her. Black women are cognizable. They make a certain kind of sense in American politics. And that just wasn't true in the 1830s.
When do you think, there are, again, you have many figures that you are tracking over this wonderful history. When would you say, or how do Black women then over this time period become, as you say, cognizant, what's the word you use? People recognize them as political actors, which isn't to say that they don't have people who are pushing back against what they're saying. But when would you say that people are, oh, yes, it's not as unusual for Black women to be political actors?
The person who comes to mind is Mary McLeod Bethune, Florida-based educator, suffragist, Black Women's Club movement leader, founder of the National Council of Negro Women. Bethune lives from 1875, from Reconstruction all the way forward to 1955, to the modern civil rights era. It's a remarkable life. But she comes to mind for me because one of the things we know about Mrs. Bethune is that she becomes a politician through, in part, her alliances with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And one of the things that Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Bethune do very deliberately, it's subtle, but not so subtle, is that they are frequently photographed together. And they do this deliberately because, of course, Mrs. Roosevelt, right, kind of brings out the camera. But by insisting and promoting their images as a duo, right, as colleagues, as allies in American politics, helps to make Mrs. Bethune recognizable. And Mrs. Bethune is nothing if not savvy about many things when it comes to American politics, including the power of, in her lifetime, the photographic image. You know, much like Fannie Lou Hamer will understand the power of the television camera to project, to amplify, and to bring her and her ideas into American homes. So I think there's a story about technology, and we could go all the way back to someone like Sojourner Truth, who is very self-conscious about the formerly enslaved advocate of abolitionism and women's rights. Sojourner Truth is someone who is photographed very self-consciously, self-crafting her image to, yes, you know, as she says, sell the shadow, right, to earn money. But of course it is to amplify her and her message at the same time. So I think Black women are always self-conscious about it, but I think it's in the 20th century, right, with the possibility of a kind of media that permits them to promote and exploit and to sort of figure out how to compel their literal images, right, into our newspapers and into our living rooms during the 6 o'clock news.
That's great. I hadn't thought, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to go back to this, something you mentioned with Bethune, which is that she had the Roosevelts as white allies. And for me, a lot of this allyship, both racial allyship, but also a kind of allyship across gender, is begins in this antebellum period. So you mentioned that Mariah Stewart is supported in a lot of ways by William Lloyd Garrison, although of course he's not able to prevent what happens with her. But that the radical abolitionist movement is radical not only because it said slavery should end immediately, but also because it pushed women into the forefront, white women and Black women. It also said that the twin almost to ending slavery is racial equality. And so there was a lot of, certainly someone like Sojourner Truth, by the time she becomes active in the movement, both experiences some of that collaboration with white anti-slavery activists, but also is disappointed by them. And there's this very dynamic set of relationships among the abolitionists in terms of white allyship. And I guess I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about the positive aspects of that, but also some of the pitfalls, because of course the anti-slavery movement leads into Seneca Falls, which is a place where we would have expected by that point, given these allyships in the anti-slavery movement, that there would have been Black women at Seneca Falls discussing the rights of women, and yet there are not. So how should we understand this attempt, this first, I would say it's the first, would you agree that it's kind of the first sustained allyship in a way, this anti-slavery movement between Blacks and whites, and women have a very central role in it?
Sure, you know, and you're absolutely right. If we sort of move through the 1830s and the 1840s and into the 1850s, we see various efforts at allyship, at sisterhood, as some will put it, in the anti-slavery movement. And I think that my reflection or my takeaway from looking closely at that is the degree to which, on the one hand, anti-slavery women do not operate in a vacuum. And that means that however they might regard one another in the intimate circles of anti-slavery work, they step out into a world that doesn't regard Black and white women with the same esteem at all. I write about the women's anti-slavery conventions of the 1830s in Philadelphia. And when those women are attacked, which they are, when their hall is burned to the ground to thwart their meetings, the problem, right, is not that women are meeting. It's that Black women are included in a meeting alongside white women as peers, as equals. That's the crux of the problem. And so there is a valiant example of sisterhood, but that when those women step out of the hall and onto the streets, it is the Black sisters who are disproportionately targeted by the mob. And so this is a challenge that plagues this movement. That's one version of it. And on the other hand, I would say that Seneca Falls, while not a meeting, as sometimes I think folks mistakenly conclude, it wasn't a meeting that excluded Black women. It's just a meeting that didn't think to include them. Even as there were women who were Black women in the village of Seneca Falls, a stone's throw from the Wesleyan meeting house, no one thinks to invite them, encourage them, make sure that they're there. And that is a different kind of challenge to the notion of sisterhood within what anti-slavery and what becomes women's rights. And for me, it is that sort of moment when we have to ask, where were Black women then if they weren't at Seneca Falls? And we discover that there's a whole world of Black women's activism that is running parallel to Seneca Falls, that I think the women at Seneca Falls aren't even particularly cognizant of, perhaps with the exception of Lucretia Mott. I think most of them have no idea. Okay, I'm gonna make that go away. Sorry.
Okay. I think we often think of only one, or maybe it's me, but only one anti-slavery movement. You're reminding me too that, you know, Lucretia Mott is of one kind of anti-slavery activist. She's there at the beginning. She is, and William Lloyd Garrison is one kind of abolitionist, but there are other less radical as well anti-slavery activists. So you have William Lloyd Garrison as one example, who was routinely walking arm in arm with other Black people, with Black men, routinely mobbed because of that, but tries to hold on to that allyship all the stronger. Whereas perhaps many of the women at Seneca Falls are not even, they're not at that level in terms of racial equality. And of course, that parallels what we see with the anti-slavery movement. It's more just about ending slavery, and the idea of racial equality gradually drops out of view. And that happens through the Civil War to some degree, and after the Civil War. One of the things I want to, let me just check our time, because I do want to bring us back to the present. I'll just mention that as I said, that widening, that early failure means that the struggle for the 19th Amendment, the very long struggle, is one in which I think Black and white women over and over are apart on that. First, of course, with the 15th Amendment and the extension of voting rights to Black men over quote unquote women. For white women, that was seen as over white women. And that is a huge problem in terms of an interracial movement. And then over and over again, white women pander, if you will, to racism as the reason that women, meaning white women, should get the vote. One of the things I was thinking of today as I was reading and thinking about your book again was the fact that voting is controlled on the local level, that even when the 19th Amendment is passed, the fact that much voting as today was controlled on the local level meant that that amendment could say women without talking about racial issues. And yet that again left another gap, correct? Could you talk a little bit about that, about Black women in the lead up to the 19th Amendment, and then for them, what was both an achievement, but still was going to be a struggle because of that?
Sure. You know, to set this up, it's important to say that Black women are voting in some places long before the 19th Amendment is ratified, in California, in New York, in Chicago, in Illinois. And so there are Black women who are experienced voters even before the 19th Amendment is ratified. But the crux of the struggle over the 19th Amendment is Black women in the South, and the insistence on the part of both Southern suffragists, but their husbands and fathers and brothers and lawmakers, right, that no 19th Amendment can be enacted if it would guarantee to Black women the vote. And so it doesn't. It just does not. It prohibits the states from using sex as a criteria when it comes to meting out voting rights. And it permits the Southern states to use the same literacy tests and grandfather clauses and poll taxes and more that have been keeping Black men from the polls. Well, now those things are going to keep Black women from the polls. And by design, there is nothing about the 19th Amendment that curbs that, nor does the 19th Amendment curb the intimidation and violence that Black women in the South in particular are going to face when they attempt to register to vote. You know, my thinking about this is still evolving. But there's a way in which, you know, while the word white doesn't get literally written into the 19th Amendment, it's there. And for any state that wants to insert it, there is nothing in the amendment that prevents them from doing so. And so we have, in the wake of what is certainly a landmark in the history of women's politics in the United States, we have profound disappointment and more for Black American women who have discovered nothing, right, about the possibility of voting rights, despite this remarkable, long, as you've said, campaign. And the legacies of that, right, I think still are with us today, right? When we ask about the distance between Black and white women in the United States on election day in 2020, I think we see the legacies of that distance, that fracturing, that inequality, and more. Black women who are still very purposeful about the vote, about using it concertedly, about using it collectively, is in part a legacy of this experience of the 19th Amendment, and learning how to practice a certain kind of politics that is necessary to make Black women felt at all on election day, certainly.
I want to switch a little bit because you have a personal history that is also one of the things that drives the book in a certain way. And I want to invite you to talk about what you learned about your own family's history of voting, what you were able to find out, maybe what you weren't in some cases able to find out. And then, but there are other elements of your family's political activism that you know about as well. And so if you could just meditate on that. And I think also as an example for many of us, like when I read about that in your book, I realized I don't really know my own family history around voting. I know a little bit about sort of day-to-day politics in my family. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing and something that all of us could do to some degree with our families, to think about that history.
Yeah, I hope so, because one of my laments as I got deeper and deeper into this book was that I didn't know how the women in my family fit in to this kind of epic story that I was trying to write. And they weren't here for me to ask. And so for those of you out there, right, who have elders and you know, those interviews, you know, turn on your phone, take out your pen, but get those stories down, because I certainly realized, you know, if you will, too late, that I hadn't collected those stories. So I use, you know, our historians' skills to try and recreate some of that. And there are a couple of things that happened that really shaped my thinking about the book overall. The first is that I in particular was searching for my own grandmother. When I got to the North Carolina State Archives, which is where I believed I would find her, she had moved there in 1926, and I thought I would find evidence of what had happened there when it came to women's votes. As you alluded to, I get to the archive and there's really very little there, some cumulative numbers, in a ledger. But the records of who voted, who registered, and more, by the 1920s, they haven't survived. And that was pretty devastating, to sit in the room, and go through the boxes, go through the folders, and realize there is no there any longer. And that led me to think about, right, the way in which archives, like a state archives, can appear like everything, like they've preserved everything and you can discover anything you want to know. But in fact, for Black and white women alike, North Carolina did not preserve the records of women's early votes in the 1920s. And so, we have to get, imaginative and creative. But the wonderful thing that happened was that I also discovered an interview that my grandmother had given years and years later in 1978 to historian Bill Chafe, who was writing a book about civil rights in Greensboro, North Carolina, where my grandmother lived for most of her adult life. And he had interviewed her. And she talked about voting rights. But guess what? She didn't talk about the 1920s at all. She talked about the 1950s and 60s. And about the voting rights activism in Greensboro that she had been connected to in those years. And she went on and on. She said it was thrilling. That's what she remembered. And that is a clue to how important it was that this book didn't end in 1920. Right. Because for Black women, many of them, the memorable story is not of the years after the 19th Amendment at all, though my grandmother was, an adult and could have voted then. It was the 50s and the 60s and the modern civil rights revolution and that road to the Voting Rights Act that was the story of voting rights for her. And so I think some readers pick up this book and are surprised that it doesn't end in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. But that bit about my grandmother sort of illustrates why it was necessary to come all the way through to 1965 in telling the story from the perspective of Black American women.
So given her example, if I can just put a fine point on it, it sounds like the 19th Amendment was not, even though it had passed, it was not the moment even when she could envision being strategic, the community, even being strategic about pushing for the vote at that point. Too much resistance, perhaps violent resistance. And it's not really until the post-World War II era that for many in the South, it's even possible to push towards what becomes the Voting Rights Act. Would that be?
The thing I'd say is, though, I think place matters in this story. And that is the story of North Carolina, right? Is intimidation, violence, very deliberate suppression of Black women's votes in the 1920s. But my grandmother in 1920 was living in St. Louis, Missouri, where her mother organized a suffrage club and taught other Black women how to pass the literacy test, how to pay the poll tax, right? How to register so that they could vote, and they do, right? So place matters in this story, and the South is very much a patchwork, right? An uneven patchwork after 1920. But it means that Black women in a border state, in an upper South state like Missouri, are voting. Black women in North Carolina and Florida and Mississippi are not.
That idea of the South as a patchwork brings me back again to a little bit more present day and thinking about kind of where we started, imagining September 2020, um, what would happen with the election, watching, not really being in Georgia, either one of us, although I have lived there for a long time, but knowing that there had been a very strong fight, really, a strong ground game in Georgia with a person in Georgia who had been in the political arena for a long time, who had created, not by herself, although most people, she's the person that we know, but there is a group of people who created the possibility for increased voter turnout, and for a very different outcome. And I'll say, as someone who lived in Georgia for a long time, there had been, since I had been there, Georgia's really a purple state. There's a lot of Democrats here, not just in the Atlanta area, but more widely. And so this, to me, your call for local, for being aware of the local context also means being aware of local opportunities, and that there's some things that can be done federal down, but there's some things that really have to happen within those locations. So I wonder, you know, given where we are on so many issues today, do you have any thoughts about how we continue to do that kind of work as citizens?
You know, this is a lesson that goes all the way back to 1920, if I could, and Ida B. Wells and her Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago. You know, Ida Wells, the great anti-lynching crusader, journalist, suffragist, and more. You know, Wells and the Black women of Chicago are highly organized. They've been voting since 1913 or so. I think it's 1913. And they play the ground game every election cycle, right? They play the ground game. They send Oscar DePriest to Congress in 1928, the first Black man to go to Congress since 1901, right? Since the advent of Jim Crow. How do they do that? Because they understand the ground game, right? They understand how to vote as a block. And you know, with all, you know, with all credit to the women of Georgia in 2020, it is a continuation, right, of that philosophy, which is, yes, you need social movements writ large. Yes, you need to litigation and constitutional challenges and lawmaking out of Congress. But politics in the United States is a ground game. And the women of Georgia in 2020 and the organizers of Georgia in 2020 play that ground game in a way that, you know, busts things wide open. But there's no substitute for that, at least in the story that I tell. And that even in the face of the failures of the 19th Amendment, right, the undermining of the 15th Amendment, Black women show up, they register, they vote, they join the Republican Party, right? They push where they can and how they can throughout this period, though too many of them, of course, can't get even to first base.
Great, well, thank you. I, of course, as always, could ask you myself many more questions, but I'm going to share the floor. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. And I have one question. I'm going to say, Mark Rudenay, hi, good to have your question here. He thanks you for this discussion. Greatly enjoyed Vanguard and Birthright Citizens. In your research, did you discover any examples of women's activism in the free Black communities of New Orleans or Charleston during the antebellum, Civil War, or Reconstruction eras? Do we have any examples that we can point to?
That's hard, isn't it? The short answer is no. And I don't want to preclude work that is discovering that, and I don't want to discourage anyone from discovering those stories. And still, it is the case that what I see in that period and where I see Black women, free Black women, contributing essentially to the story I tell is through what before the Civil War is largely local benevolent work, right? Networks of mutual aid and relief that Black women in any and every community are nearly, right, are building and operating through, right, in a context where none of that is coming to them by way of the largesse of the state. What happens to those networks over time is that they become linked during the Civil War, as they are focused now on the relief of soldiers, on the relief of refugees. And these are the very same clubs and networks that will give birth to the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in the 1890s. All right, so now by the war, these are women who have been politicized, right? Their benevolent work has become politicized. And when the urgency of Reconstruction's destruction and the rise of Jim Crow presses them, they transform those into expressly political networks. That's why the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs can have 300,000 members, right, on the eve of the 19th Amendment's ratification, because it's an old, right, and well-developed and deeply entrenched network that I credit these antebellum women activists with laying the groundwork for. So, and that is part of the story, I think, is not to, in a way, I know this is not Mark's point, but not to worry too much, right? If these are women who are not calling for the vote. Coming to the question of voting rights is a process, and it requires ideas, it requires structure, it requires opportunity. And so for me, it was very important to recover that kind of work, even as it doesn't look like, a campaign for the 19th Amendment. It is essential to ultimately that work for Black women.
That's great. That's great to hear. We have another question. Gratitude again for the presentation. Actually, it's two questions. One is, how does it feel to be a descendant of the incredible women that you're a descendant of, working for equality and basic civil and constitutional rights? And then second, and I wanted to ask you this question, so I'm glad it came up. Do you see yourself as an historian continuing their work as a woman of record? I also want to say, though, that before you were an historian, you were also a lawyer. So my additional question, because I know you, was how does the work compare? And I don't mean that in a sort of one is better than the other, but what kinds of work, in what ways are those works of activism?
Yeah. This is the kind of conversation I still have with my old lawyer friends. And I'm never sure that I win the debate when I assert, right, that I think, the kind of history that we write is its own, it's its own effort, its own act of a kind of justice. That term I am borrowing from our friend and colleague Taya Miles, that in some ways, while the mechanics and the particulars of the work I did as a lawyer and the work I do now, couldn't be more different. I'm still a researcher. I was then, I am now. I'm still an advocate for ideas. I was then, I am now. But at the same time, I think that they are, deeply connected, because I think the stories we matter tell, the stories we tell not only about ourselves, but about this country, about the unfolding and the troubles of American democracy matter. And I wrote this book not simply because I was interested or curious, but because I no longer wanted there to be an excuse, right, for general readers, right, for thoughtful people. I didn't want people to say anymore, I don't know anything about that. It's too bad it's all tucked in academic monographs and inaccessible to me as a layperson. I was tired of that, and I really wanted to change the narrative. And the 19th Amendment anniversary was a way to do that. The women in my own family sit right here on the wall over here, looking over my shoulder each and every day, especially now that I work at home mostly on, in the Zoom environment. And I feel myself very accountable to them. This is the first book where I felt their presence very strong, and their endorsement, their cheering me on. And that's hard to explain, but it is definitely a part of what sort of, you know, breathe the wind, into my wings as I was trying to finish this book. They were definitely a part of it. So thank you for recognizing them and for invoking them tonight.
Another question about the 19th Amendment. So given how circumscribed it was in practice, how should we describe it? Should we say that women got the vote, or white women got the vote, or how, you know?
I'll give it a shot. The 19th Amendment doesn't guarantee anybody the vote. It just prohibits the states from using sex as a criteria. That means that states that have in place laws that bar women from voting or reserve the vote to men aren't enforceable. And that makes a difference in many, many places throughout the United States. It opens a door, sort of. But of course, there are still many criteria by which individual states will continue to deny the vote: age, residency, citizenship, mental competency. It's still true in 1920 that American women who marry non-citizens are denaturalized and lose their right to vote. So lots of women face still barriers to voting after the 19th Amendment. For Black American women, there is in place a Jim Crow regime that has been developed, right, at the expense of Black men, that is now going to target Black women as well. The poll tax, the literacy test, the understanding clause, whites only primaries, the grandfather clause, on and on and on. And so it would be a mistake to say that no Black women vote. I mentioned briefly the example of St. Louis, Missouri, where Black women in St. Louis do indeed vote, but in too many places they don't. So the trouble with the shorthand is that, well, historians hate that, right? Because it's always more complicated, but more to the point, right? That it would be a mistake to suggest that Black women were not politically empowered, that Black women, some of them didn't have access to the polls, because they did, and they did things with it in places like Chicago. And that is part of this complicated history too. So there are lots of myths. One is that all women get the vote, and the other is that no Black women get the vote. And the reality is somewhere in between the two.
Very complicated, as we always say. One, I think, might be a final question. In Vanguard, there are a lot of places where organizing efforts coalesce into real watershed moments in terms of Black women's fight for full civic participation. And I would say, in the way that I talked about earlier, that they are breaking barriers not just for themselves, but for everyone, that when those things happen. Do you think that, does it feel like we're in the middle of that now? Or are we on the cusp of such a moment? Hopefully. Do you have, I guess I could say, do you have hope? Do you?
I'm someone who has purpose. So I get up every day because I think I have a purpose, and it doesn't require hope, frankly. I just have a purpose. That's me, how I'm wired. But more to your question, I don't think Black women have ever abandoned that vision of their purpose in American politics and in American democracy. When Black women fight for healthcare, Black women fight for a coronavirus relief package, that is Black women's politics, and that is a politics that is envisioned as speaking to the human interests of all Americans. When Leader Abrams in Georgia advocates for voting rights, she doesn't say, I'm advocating for Black women's voting rights, though certainly she's concerned with that. She doesn't even say, I'm advocating for Black voting rights, though certainly she's concerned with that. She speaks to all Georgians and all Americans. And I think oftentimes, because the words come out of the embodiment, right, a Black woman's person, that people's ears get stuffed with a very strange sort of cotton that prevents them from hearing what Black women are saying, which is, we are here for all Americans, right? We are here for everyone in this community, in the state. And so sometimes, you just want to people need to clear their ears out, because Black women have been saying this for a long time, have been defining their politics by this principle. And it is very hard, perhaps for Americans who have a more truncated or instrumentalist, vision for their own politics, can't always recognize that there are folks who are really out there speaking, as my hero, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in the 19th century would say, right? For, that great bundle of humanity, right? For everybody.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. The women of Vanguard, as I've heard you say many times over the course of this year, are trying to speak for everybody. We're trying to open it up for everybody. It really is a beautiful book, a beautiful work of history, a beautiful map of political activism, of, I would say, the best. We often talk about American ideals, and one of the things I think we need to recognize are the ways in which Black Americans have often pushed American ideals to their farthest point. And that scares people. It scares people, but let's hope we move beyond that fear. Martha Jones, thank you for this book. Thank you for bringing these women back to us, these histories, for recovering them, and really appreciate that. I'm going to now turn it over to Erin Greenwald for final words.
Thank you guys both so much. Martha, thank you for the gift of this book and all of the productive conversations that it has enabled. And thank you both for the gift of this conversation. We're so pleased to be able to have you here as part of the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities Who Gets to Vote program. We have a couple of other programs coming up in the next month. On Saturday, April 24th, we will be hosting Louisiana Poet Laureate John Warner Smith for a conversation with Chancellor Zero Skidmore on poetry in a pandemic. And John will be reading some of his poetry following the conversation. And then on Thursday, May 20th, we'll continue our conversations with historians. At 6 p.m., we'll be hosting Joshua Rothman, whose brand new book, just out this week, The Ledger and the Chain, How the Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America, will be the topic of our conversation that evening. So check out leh.org for further details. And thank you everyone for joining us. Good night.